Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is Tamir Novotny, the ED of EPIP, filling in for the illustrious Biz Gormley, who's at a Council on Foundations HR Summit today. Thank you for joining us. We are so fortunate to have Riki Wilchins with us, a longtime thought leader and advocate for gender equity. Today, we're going to be focusing on intersectional approaches to philanthropy, which reconnect race, social, and gender justice for more effective grant making. Before we turn the floor over to Riki, I'm just going to share a few things about EPIP for those who may be new. It's not working. So EPIP is a community of folks in and around philanthropy who are committed to excellence in the practice of philanthropy and who care about equity in their institutions and the broader world. And we're a place where folks can find their own, learn and practice new skills, and develop deeper substantive knowledge to support their work and leadership, and to engage with their peers in the broader community of social change agents in order to build a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. If you have any questions about EPIP membership, most of you on the line are EPIP members, but a few of you may be new, please get in touch with my colleague Biz. Her email is biz@epip.org. She's our Director of Operations and Member Services. And again, she sends her regards from a plane somewhere over the Midwest. Next week, we are going to be hosting a webinar, which is a town hall, and it's going to focus on the strategic plan that we've been working on for some time now. We've been hard at work getting a better sense of how we can better help to advance our collective hope streams for the sector. And we're going to be sharing some learnings from that process next week with Christy Tran, who is a former EPIP board member and the facilitator of that process. So please join us then. And as always, our events can be found at epip.org/events. A couple of quick housekeeping items. One, please use the question box on the lower right-hand side for technical difficulties, any comments or questions. We're going to hold questions until the end, but we will see all the questions and we're going to do our best to get to all of them. And if there are questions that we don't get into, we can always follow up with a written response. There's one poll right now in the session. All polls and questions are anonymous. The webinar is being recorded, but your questions are anonymous. If you would like to share your thoughts or notable quotes on social media, please use the hashtag EPIPWebinar. And please make sure to complete the post-webinar survey. It gives us great feedback and make sure that we're giving you guys what you need. And if you have follow-up questions and things like that, it helps us be responsive. And so with that, it is my distinct privilege to introduce Riki Wilchins, who is going to talk to you about intersectional approaches to philanthropy. And Riki, before I turn the floor over to you, I'm going to launch our one poll. And on your screen, you should see the question: to what extent is your institution's work informed by an intersectional lens? Please take a moment to submit your answer. Again, this is anonymous, but it will just give Riki and me a sense of who is on the line and help Riki tailor some of her comments.
Great. So am I live now, Tamir?
Folks should be able to hear you. Let me just take this poll one more second so that we can
okay.
results.
I wasn't sure if that was a handoff or not.
No, I'm prone to non sequiturs.
It's all good.
Okay, we have good turnout here, so I'm going to close the poll, and we should be able to see the results. Let me see if I know how to do this. Hold on, I almost did it. Generate an attendee report. Share results. Here we go. So, wow, 3/4 of the folks on the line have said that their institution's work is at least somewhat informed. Almost everybody said at least somewhat informed by an intersectional lens. So that's a great start. So Riki, now I'm going to formally shut up and turn it over to you. Let me make you the presenter.
Great. And so you can see is my screen coming through okay now?
Not yet.
Okay.
Still showing mine. I'm sure that went through.
I'm seeing poll results.
So you're the presenter. You may have to click
I
your
don't think.
screen again. It says you're showing it.
I'm still showing you as the presenter, but oh no, that's not. Okay, it came back to me. So it's got. I'm not getting the option to share my screen though. For some reason, it is blanked out.
Oh, there.
Just came up. There we go. Okay.
It's because the
It's just
poll's
a little slow. It's the poll. Got it. Tell me when the screen comes up.
It's up.
I can't see. There you go. Cool. So thanks so much, Tarun. Thank all of you for making time today. And even thank all of you that are actually listening on speaker and doing email. Thank you for coming. A little bit of background about where this work came from. For me, it actually started with a grant from Lauren Harris when he was the Ford Foundation, who asked us if we would, at the time we were an LGBT group, and asked if we'd be willing to work around issues of young black men and masculinity. And it was the first time someone had invited us to do gender-oriented work outside of the gay community, and we jumped at the chance, and then actually that series of grants actually ate the organization, and how we ended up relaunching as TrueChild. Along the way, we were invited by the Heinz Endowment, some of you may know Carmen Anderson, wonderful, to create a white paper around the impact of feminine norms on young black women and girls. You'll see that among the handouts, and out of that we actually built a curriculum that's just been piloted by groups like the Urban League and the YWCA, so very proud of that work. But I'd always wanted to also balance that out and return to some of the work we did with young black men. So we had that opportunity earlier this year when our wonderful partners, Frontline Solutions, was talking with us and with ABFE, the Association of Black Foundation Executives, and said, hey, you know, if we did a paper on this, would ABFE want to co-brand that? And they did, and out of that came the paper that you'll see as the second downloadable. So that's kind of the background for today's presentation. I think the genesis of both those papers, and also our work with Lauren, is that we've gotten better at doing intersectional models that I think address race, class, but gender often gets written off as either a women and girls only thing or something for gay and trans people only. And this idea of gender norms kind of gets lost in the mix. So our part in the food chain in writing these papers and indeed designing this curricula was to try to bring gender norms back into an intersectional model and read it back into social justice work in a way that's integral and actually links to things like race and class. So that's what we'll be talking about today. I also, a couple caveats, I will be talking sometimes, I hope not entirely inaccurately, about communities of color. I speak as a white person with that privilege. So if I get something wrong, please feel free to correct me. And if I'm inelegant, then I apologize in advance. Also, I just want to be really clear, although we'll be talking about the impact of gender norms on youth of color, this is not to argue for a return to respectability politics and the idea that if, you know, for instance, young black and Hispanic men would just learn to speak, you know, middle American, middle class diction and be quote unquote, you know, more respectful and have more subdued forms of masculinity, that all the problems and the dangers that they sometimes deal with would go away. That's not what we're arguing here. What we are saying is that gender norms do have profound effect on kids' lives across the spectrum, and that needs to be part of the discussion. So with those kind of wordy caveats out of the way, let me just kind of jump in here. A little bit about me. I've been doing this way too long. I've written 3, actually it's now 4 books on gender theory. No, that is not me on the front cover of the book. I was in Time magazine, and I've also worked with a bunch of agencies in Washington. I think that's the only reason that's on this slide, the lower left, is just to impress people. So enough about me. I just want to talk a little bit about a few terms that are going to come up repeatedly today, and one that will be lurking in the background but probably not come up as often. One is gender equity, which is ensuring equal access to things like resources and power regardless of one's race or class or ethnicity or sexual orientation. And I think that's one place we certainly want to get, is where there is equitable distribution. That's certainly something we want as funders. The piece that I really want to focus on today, obviously, is gender norms. And when you say, you know, norms, people get all kind of worried, like, oh, that sounds so complicated. Norms are really simple. One of my professors used to say, if you want to see an everyday norm in action, next time you're in a crowded elevator, start announcing every floor that you stop at. You know, it's very difficult to do. There's no reason not to do it. Nobody gets hurt when you do it, but it just makes you feel self-conscious because we don't do that. That's a norm in action. That just shows the power of norms to shape and withhold certain behaviors. And so gender norms are just these socially constructed scripts that we all start learning pretty much from birth for how to be and how to, boy and girl, how to do, male and female. And then this big word, which we're not going to talk, big phrase we're not going to say too much today, gender transformative, is a term coined by Geeta Rao Gupta, who is an expert on at-risk youth. And she said that refers to programs, funding priorities, and areas of action, and in fact public policies for that matter, that highlight and hold up and try to challenge and ultimately change rigid gender norms. The idea is to really get to gender equity, or for that matter, social equity. You have to talk about gender norms because they are such a powerful motivator of what we do and don't do, especially when we're young. I want to talk just a little bit about the intersectional approach, because I think one of the things that a lot of times we struggle with is that funding often is deeply siloed. So there's a funding portfolio for organizations around racial justice and healing, and one for women and girls, and then one for economic justice and one for LGBTQ. And as Kimberly Crenshaw told us, what we need to do is start thinking in intersectional ways and looking at the ways all these different kinds of oppression meet and overlap. In fact, Kimberly is a lawyer by trade, originally comes out of the race critical theorists, and part of the reason this was developed is when black women suffered workplace discrimination, they would try to sue as under race discrimination, and the courts turned them back and said, well, there are black men in the workplace that are not suffering discrimination, so it can't be because of your race. Then they'd sue under women-oriented statutes, and they say, well, there are white women in the workplace who are not suffering discrimination, so it isn't about you being a woman. And the intersectional theorists said we have to start looking at the intersection of black and woman, and the law has to take that into account. And that's where this whole kind of thinking came about, of intersectionality, of getting out of the silos, because people don't live in siloed bodies. They live in bodies where different kinds of oppression meet and interact. And so our thinking, our funding, and even our legal system needs to respond to that reality. So a lot of times I will talk to organizations and say, well, this is really interesting, but we already have a pretty strong gender analysis. And I want to talk a little bit about what that actually looks like in practice. So a lot of times, I'm going to use some documents here just as an example. I'm not trying to hang them up as a piñata. These are excellent documents. In fact, I use grant making with the gender lens all the time. But if you look in grant making with the gender lens, which is one of the better documents we have about a gender lens giving, and you do a search on it, which I did here, you can see the word gender norms doesn't appear anywhere, and it's 30-some pages. So this is kind of typical. People will say we have a gender analysis. What they mean is we do gender equity, but we don't have anything on gender norms. Or they'll have women and girls, but no analysis of LGBTQ or men and boys. So CCRWF is the state's preeminent policy-making body around gender in California, and they put out this wonderful document, well, the new Office of Health Equity, use a gender lens, mentions women and girls 93 times, doesn't mention men and boys once, doesn't mention LGBTQ once. So again, we also see this a lot. We have a gender analysis, meaning basically we stand up for the rights of women and girls, which is important. Women and girls obviously get only a fraction of the kind of funding they should get. But that doesn't mean it's a gender analysis. And finally, they do gender equity, but then there's no real race and class analysis. So funding for inclusion, some of you probably know this document. It is one of the founding documents for thinking about how to do gender lens giving. Right up on page 2, you can see it lists racism, homophobia, sexuality, HIV status, able-bodiedness, very, very inclusive on page 2. But then when you search on race on the next 30 pages, you get nothing. So sometimes we're kind of talking the talk without walking the walk. And again, this is very common, that the gender piece kind of gets really siloed, and cut off from race, class, and gender norms itself, and really focused on women and girls. And that's kind of what we want to talk about doing differently today. So let's talk, we kind of talked around gender norms. Let's talk a little bit about them specifically and then get to their effects. So gender norms are learned, especially during the gender intensification period, when interest in traditional ideas of masculinity and femininity starts to accelerate and belief in them starts to solidify. Research shows that gender norms are a primary rite of passage, perhaps the primary rite of passage for almost every adolescent, especially during those puberty years. And yes, that is the rapper Little Bow Wow kissing his guns. Although he's now grown up, we're just supposed to refer to him as the rapper Bow Wow. Tamir, this is where I feel like I need to have a rap name to continue. Let's see. Gender norms have effects in really interesting places we might not think about it. For instance, the school-to-prison pipeline. We know that there's over-policing and punishing of youth of color, both male and female. We don't seem to focus on as much is that a lot of it is punishing what is seen as extravagantly masculine behavior in boys, being too rowdy, talking back to teachers, etc., or girls of color who are seen as insufficiently feminine, meaning they are not measuring up to people's idea of middle-class dominant femininity. So gender is a huge part of the problem that we're seeing in zero tolerance and school push-out policies. It just isn't really being spoken of. And if you think, for instance, about how young men display public masculinity through risk-taking, boisterousness, defying adult authority figures, suffering punishment silently, pretty much a checklist for getting yourself kicked out of school. The interesting thing about the zero tolerance and other school push-out policies is they seem to be targeting kids and making kids kind of, are pressing kids to measure up to very rigid ideals of masculinity and femininity, just when they're under the most pressure to figure out how to do masculinity and femininity in their social lives. So here you have 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old kids trying to figure it out. In the meantime, the system is pushing them to do very kinds of specific behaviors and punishing them rigorously when they don't measure up. Gender norms have other effects. This is a terrifying slide. I say this as a parent of a 10-year-old daughter, done by, I think this is in Gender Health. They asked boys and girls in separate sessions to say what were the top reasons they have sex. And I hope you guys can read this on your monitors. Top 10 reasons for young men include fame, to have something to brag on, hormones. Top 10 reasons for girls, for a boy to like them, to fit in, peer pressure, so the boy won't leave her. That's tough. That just shows you normative pressures are tremendous during those gender intensification years, especially in intimate situations. Gender norms are highly regulated. The English language has a distressingly elaborate vocabulary for calling out and stigmatizing the least degree of gender nonconformity. And this is not an exhaustive list. There's probably a few dozen more, which unfortunately my daughter probably can reel off already. So if you think about words as instrumental, I mean, we invent words to communicate things, other people in a speech community, right? It's interesting that there are literally scores of words to stigmatize gender nonconformity and enforced conformity, but there are no positive words in English language to address gender conformity. To say that a man is being effeminate or a woman is looks manly are both insults. So interesting. And finally, gender norms take practice. I don't know if you all follow Boondocks. I really like his work. You can see the young man is making all these fierce faces, and then his brother peeks in and says, "You're still practicing your thug mug." And he says, "Hey, keeping it real is hard work when you're cursed with cuteness." So, a curse that Tamir and I both suffer with on a daily basis. Probably Tamir more than me, but anyway. And the impact, I'm waiting to see the comments light up on that one. And the impact of gender norms, like so many things, is unfortunately enhanced in low-income environments where there may be stronger peer pressure on the street. Gender codes may be particularly narrow, and penalties for transgression are often especially harsh. Sometimes when I do this, I'll get a question afterwards about inner cities and urban cores, and that's certainly part of it. But if you go to look at rural white boys in Lubbock, Texas, you will find almost the same things around low-income communities and gender norms. So it seems to be across the spectrum. One of the things I haven't talked about too much so far is LGBTQ youth, and this is kind of my slide on that. I'm going to give you my pitch, is that when we think about gender, often it goes right into a discussion of gender nonconformity, and that gets us to LGBTQ. What I'm trying to pitch today is the idea that gender regimes hurt not only gender nonconforming kids, I think we're finally learning that as a society, but they even hurt those who do conform to them. So even kids who do conform to rigid ideals of masculinity and femininity have markedly lower life outcomes, and we're going to get to that in the next slide. The nice thing I like about this, what I really like, is that if you look at this from a gender norms perspective, it gives you an integrated framework for looking at both gender nonconformity and LGBTQ and gender conforming under the same thing. So LGBTQ isn't like this new thing that you have to master out here. It's already inside an intersectional model if your intersectional model includes gender norms. And also from David Eng, who wrote a wonderful book called Racial Castration, as he points out, gender norms are always raced and racial norms are always gendered. So if you look, for instance, at the two depictions of femininity on the right, those are not just depictions of a certain kind of femininity, they are also raced and classed depictions of feminine norms. So we're back to intersectional again. Thank you, David. So let's talk a little bit about traditional masculine and femininity and what kind of effects it has. I think I used that picture on the lower right because I'm jealous of those guys having six-pack abs. On a good day, I have like a one-pack. The field kind of originated in the late 1980s with a researcher named Dr. Joseph Pleck at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And he decided it'd be really interesting to see if you could develop a scale that would measure how strongly young men believed in traditional masculinity as defined by things like strength, aggression, sexual prowess, emotional toughness. And he did create a scale. It's been used literally hundreds of times since then and validated. But what was even more interesting was he started thinking, wouldn't it be cool if I could cross-reference this with actual effects on behavior? And so he's been doing that every 10 years now. He's going on 40 years shortly. And he found there were tremendous intersections. Boys who believed more strongly in traditional masculine norms had more and earlier sex. They had more sexual risk-taking, also more risk-taking with things like drugs, alcohol, cars. They were more likely to drop out of school early, more likely, as I said, to be pushed out of school, and more likely to engage in either partner violence, girlfriend abuse, or even LGBTQ bullying. So this is not an exhaustive list of his research and others, but kind of gives you a checklist for lower life outcomes for things like HIV, education, economic empowerment, right? And then if you flip that on its head for girls, you look in the lower right, you got to love Disney, and it's all, I keep telling my daughter, it's all the same princess. They just keep changing the hair and the outfit. What I call the 3 Ds of traditional femininity being deferential, desirable, and dependent. The field on feminine norms has taken a little longer to blossom. We didn't really start getting good data on that until like the 2000 and since then. But you get very similar impacts. Girls who believe more strongly in traditional feminine norms, more likely to have unplanned pregnancies, more likely to defer to male sexual prerogatives, and of course also have lower condom use, more HIV, more likely to drop out of school early, more likely to tolerate abusive or coercive relationships, more likely to grow up economically dependent on an older, stronger, more powerful male, and less likely to be economically empowered. So again, kind of a checklist for lower life outcomes for young women in at-risk communities. Because there is this kind of interconnected cluster of things that are affected by gender norms, some people on the international front are starting to refer to gender norms as a gateway belief system, with the idea that once kids buy into them, they are exposed to being, they are vulnerable to having lower life outcomes in this cluster of related areas: intimate relationships, economic security, education, and particularly for girls, empowerment and leadership. So I want to talk a little bit about the base underneath what I'm trying to pitch today. There is an extremely strong research base for this. I don't know if people have used Google Scholar, but it's, you know, you type in almost any subject and it'll return every study about that ever done. So I typed in, this is a while back, I guess, masculinity HIV prevention, and you can see you get 10,100 studies. And please remember this first study, Love, Sex, Power, Considering Women's Realities in HIV Prevention. When I did this about a year ago, it said it was cited by 765 other articles. That's now over 1,000. That may be the most cited reproductive health policy paper ever, so just keep that one in mind. So Google Scholar is a really rough-edged tool at best, so probably, I don't know, half of these papers are off point, but that still leaves you with 4,000 or 5,000 papers, so it's been exhaustively studied. I also looked up femininity and teen pregnancy. You get 3,500 articles. Again, half of them are off point, but you still got almost 2,000 papers. And finally, economic security and femininity came back with almost 9,000 articles. So this is a quick way of demonstrating the field has really studied this to death. In fact, last time I talked to Joe Pleck, he said he was done with this. He considered it settled. He has moved on to studying fatherhood. And that's true of a number of the leaders in the field. They consider this settled territory. It just hasn't had a lot of impact on programs or policies, as we'll see in a moment. So there's also a very strong programmatic base. UNAIDS says gender norms are central to improving reproductive health. USAID, which does U.S. funding in developing countries, refuses to fund new programs without a strong gender analysis. PEPFAR, the President's AIDS Initiative in Africa. UNFPA, the policy people. World Health Organization keeps putting out papers on gender transformative approaches to health. International Planned Parenthood, the World Bank. In fact, there's so much programmatic work going on the international front that the USAID has started the world's worst named organizations, the Interagency Gender Working Group, or IGWG.org, hard to even say, simply to collate collate information and coordinate efforts. So tremendous programmatic base, just not here in the U.S. domestic facing. As I said, there is a kind of a historical disconnect in the U.S., and we'll talk a little bit about why, I mean, there are different theories about why I think that is. But I want to go back to that paper I was talking about, Love, Sex, Power. So in the early 1990s, in 1992, as AIDS was detonating in American cities, the CDC pulled together 40 of the top researchers and authorities on youth of color and said, you know, what's the next big drop on the meter here? What's the next big thing we could do to improve reproductive health and generally in fight HIV spread civically? And so they went on a retreat in Austin, Texas for 2 days, and out of it came this luminous paper. And what the central point of Love, Sex, Power by Hortensia Amaro, who's up there smiling in the upper right, said, you know, gender roles and norms influence, if not define, how young people act in intimate situations. Well, duh. Anyone who's been 12 knows that. Astounding as it may seem, the central role of gender is being ignored. We are studying this in a gender vacuum. We are studying kids in a gender vacuum. So that paper came out in 1995. As I said, it's been cited well over 1,000 times. You figure, wow, that approach must have really marinated through the field. It's been over 2 decades, but not so much. If you look, for instance, at Emerging Answers, which is distributed by the National Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy, practically the Bible of teen pregnancy prevention and teen sexual behavior, and you look at its 200 pages, for the words masculinity or femininity, you will not find them anywhere except in footnote 295 in the title of Joe Pleck's original 1995 paper on masculine norms. So that's what a research policy disconnect looks like. Literally thousands and thousands of papers going back almost 3 decades and no impact on funding policy or programs at all. And I asked Dr. Doug Kirby, who wrote the paper, this giant in the field, we just lost him. I said, how can you have 200 pages on teen dating behavior and not once mention masculinity or femininity? And he said, we evaluate programs, and we could not find any programs in the US with a strong gender focus to evaluate. I'm also proud to say that one of the first invitations when we first launched TrueChild 7 years ago, the first invitations we got was to address the White House, the Office of National AIDS Policy, ONAP was there, and they thought this was really cool stuff. And so I immediately downloaded the PDF of the National AIDS Policy and went looking through it as I do for masculinity, femininity, gender norms, and of course, if you look at the search bar coming up, again, the word masculinity doesn't appear in there anywhere. So pretty amazing, a 60-page National AIDS Policy. We are decades into this academic. Hortensia Amaro back in '93 and all her friends said, hey, the biggest thing you could do, CDC, is to study gender norms, and we're still stuck in that gender vacuum. So again, that's what a research policy disconnect looks like. I mean, we know by now that young men bear back because promiscuity and being invulnerable are sexy, and discussing your health vulnerabilities and engaging in cuddle sex with one guy are not. And yet somehow it still doesn't make it into our national AIDS policy. So that's a pretty profound disconnect. I've thought a lot, pretty much like 4 or 5 times a day, about why this is and why this research circulates endlessly in the academic silo and the international space, but never emerges to impact domestic funding or policy or programs. And I have an idea. I don't know if it's the right idea, but this is my best take for whatever it's worth. It's kind of a throwaway slide. If your logic model is that every young person is a complete individual who enjoys full autonomy and can make their own decisions and reach them based on the available knowledge, then naturally your funding model, your funding focus should be on things like offering training, information, programs, and opportunity, all of which are important. I don't mean to say that they're not. But if your logic model is instead that young people are often deeply embedded in a social context, particularly in at-risk communities where there's few resources and they need a social context to survive, they lack anything like full agency. And they are subject to a tremendous amount of pressure and ideals and gender norms that we've spoken of. Then your funding focus should also be looking at things like beliefs, attitudes, and practices, or what we call normative behavior. Because that's all gender norms really are, beliefs, attitudes, and practices. And I think that's the missing piece. Our model acts as if everyone is an empowered individual, what I call the empowerment model. And having a 10-year-old at home, I don't think it really matches her reality. But by the time you're old enough to make funding decisions, you forgot how terrifying it was your first day of middle school. As someone once said, I think it actually was, might have been Hortensia, but they said, you know, gender norms, when young kids get together, gender norms determines who does what to whom, when, and for what reason, particularly when it comes to things like sex or aggression. It's gender norms that determine who does what to whom, when, and for what reason. I like that. So we're almost done here. I just want to say, you know, I'm not trying to say oversell my proposition here. It's not all gender norms. These are, as I said at the beginning, these are complex intersectional problems. There is no silver bullet here. But if you were looking for the next big drop on the meter in programmatic effectiveness, the next thing that would really increase your grantees' work and the efficacy, the social return on your philanthropic investment at truly marginal cost, it would have to be gender norms, because when you teach young people to think critically about gender norms, you get better life outcomes than if you ignore them. And I'm just going to repeat that because that is the crux of this presentation. When you teach young people to think critically about harmful gender norms, you get better outcomes than if you ignore them. Or put another way, you get better outcomes if you not only address racial and economic justice, but if you connect it with gender justice. Just as we learned, racially sensitive programs are more effective, so gender-sensitive programs will be more effective too. Because it's beliefs that drive behavior. It's what we learn. If you're into the social determinants of health model, you know, all about how people learn from one generation to the other. Belief systems drive behavior. Oh boy, Outlook. Sorry, PowerPoint makes you look so good. You all these special effects. So I don't want to paint a completely dark picture. There are a number of leading nonprofits that are really on the bandwagon for gender transformative approaches, doing amazing work. Certainly Men Can Stop Rape in DC, Futures Without Violence. I mean, these are all great organizations doing cutting edge work in this area. And there are more than a few funders that have moved forward important grants around gender norms. And in fact, we now finally have 3 or 4 funders that have put gender norms into specific guidelines for their portfolios or their entire foundation. So there is kind of a core. This idea is really starting to take hold. And I think in 5 or 10 years, we're going to look back and see that this was the beginning. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you all very, very much. And Tamir, thank you for having me. I hope there are some comments or questions or discussion.
Riki, thank you so much for that presentation. So if folks have questions or comments, you can do it 2 ways. One, you can type them in the questions box on the webinar control panel. The other way is to raise your hand, and there should be a little hand raise button on that control panel just hanging off the left-hand side. While folks are preparing their questions or comments, Riki, I have a couple for you. So one, going back to that slide that you had about with the 3 arrows connecting, if I'm remembering correctly, agency, social context, can you talk a little bit more about the connection between the arrows on the left and right-hand sides?
Yeah, do you mean this part or the second part of it, the second iteration?
Yeah, the second part.
Okay. The phones never stop ringing here at EPIP. So, you know, I think that when you're an adult, you're relatively empowered, and you have something like real autonomy, and you can make rational decisions. And you kind of, I think often we tend to assume that the kids we're working with are similar. Mm-hmm. And in some important ways, they're not. As I tried to say, I think kids are deeply embedded in a social context. They are not just moved by proper information, but also about you know, what they hear, what they're afraid of, what they're afraid, you know, boys will think about them, or boys are afraid girls or other boys will think about them. They don't have full agency. They are dependent on what other people think. And in that kind of situation, it makes sense to think about beliefs and attitudes and practices. And that's really all gender norms are. It's how we learn to behave and what's expected of us. So the first time, you know, I'm going to pick on reproductive health because it's easy, but the first time a boy and girl, I'm assuming heterosexuality here, are, you know, making out and deciding, you know, what's going to happen next, you know, all those really primitive ideas about, you know, who does what in bed are kind of silly. By the time you're 50, you've figured it out, you've looked behind the curtain. Mm-hmm. But when you're 12, that seems like holy writ. That's all you know. What you've seen in the movies, what you've seen in videos, and that's what you figure you're supposed to do. So I think that's true in a lot of these areas. One of the, I don't know if folks may have seen this, the big nationwide campaign called Real Men Wear Gowns, and it showed just these hairy legs sticking out of a hospital gown. And the idea was to try to get young men to go to the hospital, because young men are taught that when you're in pain, you suck it up and you know, bow your neck and you don't complain, and you certainly don't ask for help. Real men don't need help. And so young men, particularly in low-income communities, were waiting until their bodies were in crisis from sometimes treatable or even preventable illnesses because they wouldn't go get medical help. Gender norms don't, I mean, it's kind of squishy. You know, race and class are kind of these perceptual givens. You can kind of see them. But gender norms are these squishy kind of beliefs, and it's hard to see beliefs, so it's hard to think about gender norms. But boy, the effects are so strong. There's a nationwide campaign because they found they could save thousands and thousands of lives if they could just convince young men to go to the doctor when they were in pain, when they were hurt, when they were sick. So the belief systems need to be a part of our model. And I'm going to say this again, it's on one of the slides. Beliefs drive behavior. We keep thinking, well, You know, if we have little empowered units, if we just give them enough programming and funding and opportunity and information, their behavior will follow. It just doesn't work that way. And I'm going to throw one more on the iron. One of the areas we work in is girls in STEM, because feminine norms is not addressed at all in STEM, you know, science, technology, engineering, and math. And we keep telling the field, you know, you're addressing all these external barriers. You're doing implicit bias. You're doing lack of role models. But we ask the girls, you know, why are you dropping out of STEM classes in middle school? You know, can't you be pretty and popular with boys and good at science and math? They would all look at each other and then bust out laughing and go, not in junior high, you can't. So, you know, these belief systems and what kids think other people think about them, this huge social context, tremendous effects on the things that, you know, we as change makers and philanthropists want to make better. Did that answer your question? Or did I wander around it?
It does. Thank you. A follow-up question. So a lot of what we've been talking about centers on support for potentially individual young people to support them in shifting their beliefs, attitudes, and practices so that they engage in behaviors that then support better life outcomes. What about the systems that they're embedded in that create the social context that, you know, define the level of agency any one individual may exercise that exert these pressures on them? For the folks who are working on systems change initiatives, how can they bring this lens to the system?
Yep. Well, let me start to the first part of the question with the predicate, which is, I don't think we're going to change kids' beliefs, attitudes, and practices. I mean, I can't change my daughter's mind about what to watch on Nick Jr. So I don't want to oversell this. You can't change you can't change a teenager's mind about anything. What you can do is try to give them the tools to think critically for themselves, and that's what I want my daughter to do. You know, if she's going to go see a Disney movie, I don't mean to pick on Disney, but I want her to think critically about, you know, what does it mean when they show, you know, cartoon characters that have, you know, blonde hair, blue eyes, and a 17-inch waist, and little tiny hands and feet. I don't mind her seeing it. I want her to think about it, not just take it in. And as I tell parents sometimes, if you don't want to have a place in this conversation with your kids, that's fine, because, you know, MTV and videos and YouTube are all having a 24/7 conversation with your kids about how to be a boy or a girl. So the question isn't like, are we going to talk to them? Everyone's already talking. The question is, are we going to have a place in this conversation? So that was kind of the first part of your question. The second part about the systems change, I think, is profound. You know, we usually end up intervening at the level of young people because that's the easier. It's easier to give tools to a person than to try to change a whole system. But I do think that we need to start looking outside the person. I haven't talked about that very much in most of my presentations because I'm still trying to get people just over the hump of being comfortable talking about and thinking about gender norms. But I think you're right. We need to be doing more two-gen approaches that address the parents and the children as a unit. We need to start talking about getting this into schools. You know, gender norms need to be an integral part of social and emotional learning. It needs to be part of the whole package that goes around kids. I don't think we're there yet, but I think you're where the field hopefully will be in 10 years.
And what about folks who are working on issues other than youth development, say they're in environmentalism, or they're focused on, I'm drawing a blank here, but the arts, any number of other areas of focus? How can they apply the kind of lens that you're talking about to their work?
Well, I think environmental interest, arts is, I mean, I'm not really familiar with the research on arts and gender norms. If somebody else is, feel free to make a comment instead of ask a question. I think the environmental thing is interesting to me because I remember saying to one funder, you know, this doesn't work in every field. For instance, doesn't work in environmental work. It turns out that it does. I haven't seen that done domestically, but internationally, there are a lot of cutting-edge agencies and nonprofits that are adopting a gender transformative focus. And one of the things they're finding is that women treat the environment and its resources in very different ways than men do in developing countries, and that you get much better environmental outcomes if you take a gender transformative focus that also talks about the norms. I mean, men sometimes will go in and exhaust the fishing resources where women will try to conserve it and use it and share it and take care of it. In terms of how women farm, there are a whole bunch of, and I was like, there's a group, CGIAR. I think of it as CGAR, but it's not. It's CGIAR, and I forget what it stands for. But they are just doing some mind-bending work on bringing a gender norms focus to environmental protection. Just really cool stuff. I would love to see that tried here in the U.S. I think that would be really fascinating.
Cool.
Yeah.
Folks, just a reminder, if you've got questions or comments, you can either hit the raise your hand button or you can type them right into the questions box, and we're ready to ask them for you and get them answered. While folks are doing that, my next question is for those of us who are totally on board with what you're saying, and we're trying to either integrate this into our portfolio, or we're trying to convince our institutions that we need to do what some of the foundations featured on your slide are doing, right, in bringing a gender lens to their entire portfolio. What challenges have you seen sort of leaders in that work run into, and what advice do you have for our members in advocating for change?
Well, I think there are a couple things. As Lauren Harris said, and I love Lauren because he was on this well before almost any of us. He said, grant makers are not challenging their grantees to do cutting-edge work around gender norms the way they are issues of race or class. So I think that's one thing, is find a way to make some grants that address gender norms. Find groups in your portfolio that are already doing this, but maybe not talking in those terms because you haven't asked them, or find groups that are willing to be trained up and bring in someone to work with them. But I think if you can, one of the things we did with Heinz is we said, look, we can't train your entire portfolio, but we're going to train just a couple of organizations who have the capacity and interest, and they can train the others. And that way we're out of there and it becomes self-sustaining. So, our lead guys on this were the Urban League and the YWCA because they loved it, it worked for them, and they have the capacity and the stability to teach the rest of, the Heinz portfolio. So I think that, train the trainers model is a great way to make this self-sustaining and low cost. Well, increasingly, in the early years, we were asked to do curriculum development, and we're still doing that. And I love doing curriculum development. And I find increasingly funders are saying, no, how do I shift the whole organization? Or how do I shift a portfolio that has, 50 grantees in it? Or a foundation that has 90 or 100 grantees. And so what we're starting to think about now, especially, I partner a lot with Frontline Solutions, I love their work, is we're starting to think about automated online tools and also ways to, where you can train, bring 90 grantees. So automating is one thing, because then they can step through it at their own pace and apply it to whatever part of the, if they are in the arts, they are in economic development, or they are in reproductive health. And the other thing we're looking at is systemic models for a whole organization that allows us to teach them all up at the same time and then bring them together in kind of a peer learning thing, so they all kind of get it and it gets worked through their DNA, and after 2 or 3 years you're done. And I think that's really exciting. So I think there are different approaches when you're talking about 20 groups in a common portfolio versus 100 groups over a dozen portfolios. So
one place where this shows up a lot in our work is even in-house. So our network is 65% women, and many of our chapters have done programming on women's empowerment and philanthropy. And the classic example that we hear all the time is a cis woman in philanthropy, advocates for something that she believes in, and then is told that she's being too assertive, too aggressive, whereas that behavior is reported in her male colleagues, right? And that's only worse if she's a person of color, then there's double backlash.
Right.
To what extent are you seeing these focuses on gender lens and programming also start to influence internal dynamics around support for a wider range of expressions that are authentic to the leaders, and opening up of space for people to lead authentically?
This is a discussion we just had actually with the New York Women's Foundation, which I think kind of really gets this is, not only how can we do this as a programmatic activity, but how can our grantees do this as a programmatic activity, but also how can they learn to think intentionally about their own policies, their own hiring, their own distributions of power, their own management. And so we're starting to think now about, self-assessment tools at the organization level, at the portfolio level, and at the individual level that people could work through to kind of, we call them gender audits, where they can look at their materials, their policies, their practices, and get an idea of where they are and where they need to, where they could easily integrate a gender norms perspective. So again, I kind of love that. I think that kind of systemic level work is really fascinating and where this needs to go.
Thank you. The last couple of years, we've seen a rise of what some have called a sort of new breed of social movement. I think of Black Lives Matter as an example, led by women, some of them queer women, unapologetic, upfront about what they believe, define what folks might consider certain gender norms. And I'm speaking really here at the edge of the depth of my knowledge. So if I'm mischaracterizing this, but I'm wondering if you see those movements and perhaps some of the inflections of gender and the intersection of race potentially trying to figure out how to articulate the question, but I don't know if it's suggesting different norms or possibly changing the game as far as, to your point about there being a very rigid social context in some cases, that opening up in some way.
Well, I love the work of Black Lives Matter, and I also like that they're, especially when it comes to some of the people who are both transgender and Black, who've been killed, and that's a whole epidemic by itself, that they've been all over that and they haven't backed away from it. I'm not sure where this is going to go in terms of bringing gender more front and center into the dialogue. I mean, I get that we actually started as a transgender rights organization for all intents and purposes. And after 10 or 15 years, we said, well, this has finally taken hold. And that's one of the reasons we switched to doing issues of gender conformity. And I'm delighted that has taken hold, that people are understanding transgender in a way that we could never have understood. I mean, this would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. At the same time, I worry that that's all we're going to get, that we're all going to tune into Transparent on HBO, and then we're going to watch it and feel like, oh, we get transgender, and that's all we really need to know about gender nonconformity and gender norms, is this one marginalized group that's about 1% of the population. And so what we're trying to say is, no, there's 30 years of research that says that rigid gender norms also hurt the other 99% of the population as well. If anything, transgender people are at an endpoint. They are the canary in the mine shaft.
Yeah. And in a time when the notion of political correctness is really sort of being put front and center in light of presidential politics and just a general backlash against a greater level of awareness in our language, to what extent do you see the potential to challenge some of the sort of mass level enforcement of gender norms that comes with our popular culture, and that may vary? I'm not quite sure how to ask the question, but
you could be talking about a presidential campaign, which, as far as I can tell, is completely a gender war. I mean, we're having a huge national discussion right now, or what are the norms of masculinity and masculine and feminine behavior. And that's one of the things that makes this election so fascinating to me. Someone put out a map of if only men voted, and it showed basically the entire United States except California, New York, and I think Massachusetts in red. And then it showed the same map if only women voted. It flipped the whole thing. So there is a fascinating dialogue right now going on about what kinds of normative masculinity and femininity are acceptable and what it's okay to do and to say. I also think there's a whole level that we're not discussing, which are just, what they call microaggressions, just these simple ways in which, even unconsciously, some of us treat other people differently based on their sex, their gender nonconformity, their race, whatever. And I think that's a much more difficult level sometimes to address because it happens in these little tiny everyday interactions. Interestingly enough, that was something that Foucault talked about for years, and this goes back to postmodernism, that they talked about the power of these everyday little interactions to determine behavior. It's very much, the whole thing around microaggressions is very much linked to issues of gender norms and social practices. So they anticipated a lot of stuff, but that's a part of the discussion we're not quite having yet. But I find this whole discussion about, this is, I mean, I don't mean to get down on Trump, but this traditional white boy masculinity, and Hillary, if anything, is traditional, you know, white girl femininity in many ways. And this discussion we're having and the kinds of claims that are being leveled is really a national kind of wringing out of the conscience of, you know, 1950s gender roles that we're having to rethink. It's really kind of fascinating.
Thank you.
And we are a nonpartisan organization. Let's throw that out there. I'm not passing judgments.
As are we.
Absolutely.
So I out of respect for, oh, that's right. I always forget that the clock on this computer is a couple of minutes fast. So last call for questions. And while we're doing that, I just want to say that this is, you know, part of a much broader and deeper discussion that EPIP considers itself a part of around intersectional approaches to equity work and to philanthropy. We're very proud to be a part of the Change Philanthropy Coalition, which includes organizations like ABFI, which was a co-author of the report that Riki referenced, and that is in the handout section. With apologies, by the way, the handout on Black women and girls, the download didn't quite work properly, so we can send that out afterwards to anyone who's interested. And there are any number of ways to look at the question, and it's one that we're going to continue to dig into, to work in partnership with folks in our community. And if you have questions that are within or beyond the scope of this webinar, if there are things that you feel like we got wrong, we want to be a place where folks can really hash those things out and have confidence in the community as a safe space to ask tough questions. If there are issues that you would like to see us take on in the realm of intersectional grant making, please be in touch. You know how to reach me. I'm Tamir, Tamir @epip.org. And if any of you have ever gotten an email from me, you know my business line is also my cell number. And really, like, I encourage people to call, text, email me anytime. And we're also happy to answer any questions offline if folks didn't feel comfortable raising them in this forum. Riki, any closing thoughts or comments?
Just two real quick ones. One, both of these papers and an online research clearinghouse are available at truechild.org/Hines. Truechild.org/Hines, like the ketchup. We encourage folks to share them widely. Please feel free. And also, part of my day job is giving this presentation face-to-face around the country. So if you're at a foundation where you feel like, gosh, I just wish my program, other program officers, or my boss got this, let me know. And if I'm in, I'm almost everywhere sooner or later in your part of the country, we can do it without any cost or any obligation. I don't come with my handout, but we do like a 30-minute brown bagger with time for Q&A to kind of get people at different foundations up to gender norms one-on-one. So feel free to get in touch with Tamir, with me directly if you think you might be interested, and we'll see when I'm going to be in your backyard next.
Thank you. And similarly, if you are trying to advance an intersectional or even a gender-based lens in your portfolio, in your institution, we'd love to hear about your experience, especially if you're running into challenges. We want to better understand how we can support our members in advancing this kind of work. So with that, we're going to close up. I want to thank you guys so much for joining us today for a really great conversation, and especially a giant thank you to you, Riki, for all the time that you put into this. So grateful to have you as part of our community.
Thank you.
And looking forward to further conversations.
Thank you, Tamir. It's been a blast. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.